Hello, everyone! Welcome to the Beta Builds of Fire Emblem panel for EmblemCon 2025. My name is Digital Dreams, and I will be your host in this explanation through the various beta builds and working builds of the Fire Emblem series. Throughout the next hour, I'll be telling you all about the developmental forms of various games in the Fire Emblem series, including a few demonstrations for beta builds that we have access to today. If you're seeing this in this current format, then this is the YouTube re-upload of my panel that I do every single time I upload an EmblemCon panel. I want to have a backup of it so that people can go back and watch it whenever they would like. I am so sorry about how long this one took to get out. I graduated from college the literal week after last year's EmblemCon, and things have been very hectic for the last year, and it took me an extremely long time to get around to it. But since EmblemCon 2026 is right around the corner, I was like, okay, it's time. Let's sit down and record the beta builds panel. So here we are, and I hope you all enjoy it. Before we get started properly, allow me to introduce myself in full. I've been a panelist at EmblemCon since the beginning, and this is my 6th year presenting and my 5th informational panel. In the past, I've done presentations about cut content, glitches, lost media, and the various ways Fire Emblem games change throughout development. You can find all of my past informational panels recorded on my YouTube page, and this video is obviously the newest in that lineup. Outside of EmblemCon, I'm a writer, and I've written a lot of stories for Fire Emblem over the years, including a rewrite of Fates and over 400 fan-made cut support conversations for Tellius. I've loved Fire Emblem for a very long time, and I've always been interested in the various forms of a game leading up to release. For this panel, I did a bunch of research into the unreleased versions of Fire Emblem games, and I'll be sharing it with you all here for EmblemCon. I hope you're all excited to learn about beta builds, because there are a lot of great ones across the series, including a few that you can play for yourself whenever you would like. Today, I'll be taking you through 6 games we know about working builds for. Binding Blade, Blazing Blade, Sacred Stones, Path of Radiance, Radiant Dawn, and the unreleased Fire Emblem Wii. I'm focusing specifically on the known builds of these games, what we know about them, and where they have been shown off over the years. All games have beta builds in some form or another, but the majority of our knowledge about them is centered around the GBA and Tellius eras of the series. I talked about how a lot of games changed over development in my presentation for 2024, so this year we'll be focused specifically on the working builds we either know a lot about or have direct access to. We'll be going in chronological order for the release dates of these games for the informational segment of the presentation. After that, I'll be finishing off the panel with something a bit more hands-on. Some of you may know that we have access to beta builds for Blazing Blade and Sacred Stones because of a data leak in October of 2008, and they are freely accessible to the public now. I will be finishing off this presentation by sharing a few video demonstrations of the beta builds for these 2 games. All footage in them was recorded by me, and I look forward to showing you the most interesting parts of these beta builds and the secrets they hold. So without further ado, let's get started. Out of every game in the Fire Emblem franchise, Binding Blade is the one we know the most about in terms of beta builds. Because this game had perhaps the messiest development cycle out of any Fire Emblem game ever. Binding Blade was released for the Game Boy Advance in March of 2002, but its story goes all the way back to 1997, 5 years prior. That was when Fire Emblem was confirmed to have a game in development for the N64 in an interview. Shigeru Miyamoto declared that Fire Emblem 64 would be coming out in the second half of 1998, and the game was later announced in September 1998 as being called Maiden of Darkness. But none of that was meant to be. 1998 ended, and the release date passed everyone by. The game never came, and neither did any other news about it. It wasn't until January of 1999 that anyone mentioned Maiden of Darkness again. That was when Shozo Kaga stepped forward and said that Maiden of Darkness was becoming too ambitious for the N64, and Thracia 776 would be developed as the next game in the series. Thracia 776 would later go on to be the worst-selling Fire Emblem game because it was released on the Super Famicom 3 years into the N64's lifespan. This era of Fire Emblem was notably messy in terms of development, and things only got messier when the Fire Emblem Treasure Book was released later on in 1999. Many fans thought this would finally be where they learned about Maiden of Darkness after no one had mentioned it for so long. However, the book didn't mention the game at all, and it was proof that Maiden of Darkness had once again been quietly postponed. Kaga left Intelligent Systems on August 15, 1999, shortly before the release of Thracia 776. It seemed like all attention was now going to have to fall on the N64 Fire Emblem games since there was nothing else to develop. But Maiden of Darkness wasn't a Nintendo 64 game. Not really. Instead, it was planned for the Nintendo 64 disk drive. Unfortunately, the disk drive was a commercial failure, and most games for it were pretty quickly cancelled after it became clear that the console was crashing hard. This, combined with Kaga's departure from Intelligent Systems and the fact that it was struggling to function on its own hardware, culminated with Maiden of Darkness being permanently cancelled on September 24th, 2000. The game was instead declared to be reworked into a GBA game that was, at the time, set to be called Priestess of Darkness. Maiden of Darkness never saw the light of day, and because its development history was so rocky, we never saw any actual footage of it. Everything we heard about Maiden of Darkness was from interviews. The game never even made it to an E3 or any other gaming presentation. For a long time, all we knew about Maiden of Darkness was that it was a cancelled Nintendo 64 disk drive game that fell apart for more reasons than one person could ever hope to count. But that all changed on November 11th, 2015, when the Making a Fire Emblem book was released. The book was released for the series' 25th anniversary, but it was largely focused on Awakening and Fates. There were a few nuggets of gold in it from other games. For example, we finally learned more about Maiden of Darkness after the game was left as nothing but a memory over 15 years prior. We have a single selection of Maiden of Darkness' script along with a screenshot of what the game would have looked like. The art style is very clearly a pre-evolution to the final style used in the GBA games, resembling a midpoint between the Thracia and Binding Blade art styles. Personally, I think these two characters resemble Klein and Pent for the left man and Kath for the right girl. We know their names too, Ephraim for the man and Ray for the girl. A scripted exchange between them was also included in the book. On top of the script, the book gave us a few pictures of character concepts. Most of these characters wound up being unused in the final game, and we can't really see many traces of these characters in Binding Blade. However, their names are a different story, and a lot of the names found in Maiden of Darkness' developmental content did end up getting reused. Ray was changed to Rai, spelled differently, and was assigned to a completely different character, a boy instead of a girl as Binding Blade's male dark mage. Ephraim went on to be used for one of the Twin Lords of Sacred Stones. Roy's original name was Ike, which then went on to be used in Path of Radiance for that game's main character. Idun was also used in Binding Blade, though the character with her name looks very different in the concept art when compared to the final game. Bors and Eliwood were two other names that made it into the final game, albeit under very different appearances. Owain was never used in a Japanese Fire Emblem game, but it was given to a character from Awakening. His Japanese name was Yudes, but in English it takes inspiration from Maiden of Darkness. It's difficult to say if this was coincidental or on purpose, though. We have a few other names here too, though these were not used in the final game. Taki, Helen, and Lynette. Some concept art has no names attached to it at all, so obviously we don't know much about those. It's difficult to say if we're ever going to get any other material from Maiden of Darkness than we already do have our hands on. Intelligent Systems seems to have a bit of material from it, so they could use it for the Making a Fire Emblem book, but no one can say what form the game is in or if it's even functional. One of the main reasons it was scrapped was because it was becoming too ambitious for its hardware, even with the disk drive's increased strength to run games. So it was probably downsized and simplified a lot when it became Binding Blade. The screenshot we have implies that there could have been a base that the characters could move around in, or at the very least, it could have existed as a space for cutscenes. In the end, this potential feature wound up being axed when the game moved to the Game Boy Advance. The development process for Binding Blade continued to be rough and experimental for a while, and it took quite some time before the game reached its final form. As such, we have a lot of examples of various beta builds, and the first comes in January of 2001. There was a Famitsu article published on January 19th, 2001, and that was where we first saw our hints of what would become Binding Blade. The first known screenshot of the game is a very early rendition of the battle screen. An enemy female mage is casting a thunder spell on Shanna, and multiple things about this image are interesting. For one, the health bars resemble swords and are very different from the simple bars of the final game. On top of that, the enemy casting the spell is female. In the final game, generic enemy mages are only male, so it's interesting to think that there was once planned to be more gender diversity among the enemy's ranks. There was another screenshot of the game that surfaced just a few days later, with Alan and a villager. This image was published in an issue of Nintendo Power. In this picture, I want to draw your attention to the sprite of the unpromoted female mercenary in the back. This sprite is present and unused in all three of the GBA Fire Emblem games, since there is never an unpromoted female hero that you can recruit. Echidna comes promoted, and all other mercenary units are male. It's interesting that this sprite has existed as far back as this first known build for Binding Blade on the GBA. Unfortunately, these two pictures are all we really know about this build of Binding Blade. By the time we next saw the game, it had changed significantly in appearance, and the unique details of this build did not stick around for Binding Blade's next public spotting. Like all of these panel videos, I'm recording in one take, so that was a water break. The next public sighting of Binding Blade was at Space World in 2001. This is the most well-known of the early Binding Blade builds, and we have quite a bit of surviving footage of it. Even though we don't have the game's files, we have a promotional flyer, a magazine photo, a few screenshots, and even a pre-release trailer. The trailer is admittedly low in quality, but I have brought it up anyway, for us to watch together. The UI is finally getting closer to the final game, having ditched the sword HP bars for something much more similar to the Binding Blade we all know. The weapon icons here are still placeholders though, and they are taken from Thracia 776 since the final ones likely were not finished yet. Another interesting change is that during enemy phase, the player units and enemy units would switch sides. That meant the attacking unit was always on the right in the Space World 2001 build. Interestingly, Lilina was going to be recruitable in Chapter 1 instead of Chapter 8, like in the final game. A few other screenshots of this build show a Berserker getting a critical hit on a dragon, along with Roy fighting the game's first boss. The color scheme is slightly different, and it was less saturated than in the final game. Another poster of the Space World 2001 build has a collection of characters on it, and the bottom has screenshots of the game. A lot of characters are on the poster, and for the most part they look fairly similar to the final game. Another poster shows Roy and Lilina alone. You can see Roy's old design on this poster, and it certainly changed a lot before the final game came out. His in-game portrait was changed to fit the new design shortly before the game's release, but his map and battle sprites still use his original design with the spikier hair. An interview tells us that the original design was made to appeal more to younger children, and I have to wonder what younger children the developers thought would be playing a Fire Emblem game in the first place. I can only assume that this not really making much sense is why the design wound up being changed to its final iteration in the end. There are a few other builds of Binding Blade that are a bit harder to classify because we don't know what order they were made in. January 2001 and Space World 2001 are fairly easy to recognize, but there are a bunch of miscellaneous screenshots from other builds that came after Space World 2001 but before the release of the game. We'll start off with this build that has an early version of Chapter 2. The UI is slightly different from both the Space World build and the final game. We're getting closer to release though, so the bulk of the game is recognizable. As for differences though, the mountains have brighter colors and the shading on them is purple. The village background used during conversations is different too, with smaller buildings and mountains. The villager in this picture looks a little bit different too. The next three pictures are not specifically assigned to any build, but it seems likely that they are from this version of the game because the shading on the mountain and the other coloration. The purple mountain shading really is a standout feature of this build and others that came out around it, and it makes it very easy to identify when compared to every other easily distinguishable build. Next, we have another evolution of Chapter 2, but this time the colors are closer to the final game. The colors are subdued compared to the final release, and the purple shading on the mountains is gone. Instead, the mountains are shaded a bit closer to how they would end up in the final game. We're steadily getting closer to how the game looks as of release. From here, we have two battle screenshots on the right and left, and they seem to use the same UI and colors. This implies that they are from yet another build, though they seem to come after the build that used darker colors in Chapter 2. Speaking of that build with darker colors, that seems to be the same one as the screenshot in the middle of Clarine and Narshan talking. The coloration of this conversation looks very similar to the previous build discussed on the last slide. It's a bit difficult to tell them all apart though, because, again, none of these are attached to a designated build in any articles or interviews. For our last batch of screenshots, we have two that use the older UI from previous builds. It seems that this battle screen format was in use for a lot of the development cycle, and it was only changed close to the end of the development process. The UI seen on the right is getting closer to the final game, but it's still not quite there yet. Funnily enough, we actually don't have any screenshots from Binding Blade's beta builds that use the same UI as the final game, adding more credence to the theory that it was changed to look like that pretty late on in the development process. All in all, we really don't know how many Binding Blade beta builds there are. We know that there are a lot of them, though. We can only name 3 definitively, those being Maiden of Darkness, January 2001, and Space World 2001, but there are a lot of miscellaneous unnamed builds that have never seen the light of day. Binding Blade had a very rocky development process, and the fact that it has so many unreleased builds that vary so notably from each other is proof of it. But we're not done talking about Binding Blade builds just yet. There's still one more that needs to be talked about. The English translation that was planned to be released internationally, but never came out. Back in 2002, the plan was for Binding Blade to be the first ever Fire Emblem game to release overseas, but this never came to be. Nintendo of America announced that they would be translating Binding Blade into English and then releasing it into English-speaking regions, but this project never came to fruition. It is most likely this project was quietly shelved at some point during the development process. This build is a bit of a question mark because we don't know for sure if it ever existed. For all we know, Nintendo could have said they were going to translate it and then never even started. So there could be nothing from this build at all, meaning it would have only been a theoretical rather than something that was actually started. This build's existence is unconfirmed because we don't know how deep it was into development before getting shelved. If it exists, we have no evidence of it. We may never know if this build ever existed. No one can say for certain, unfortunately. And it's time for another water break. For our next 2 beta builds, we finally turn our attention to a new game, Blazing Blade. But we're not looking at promotional material this time to know what the game was like during development. We actually have proof of what it was like. In October of 2008, Intelligent Systems suffered a massive data leak, and 3 things from the Fire Emblem series were made available to the public. 2 prototypes of Blazing Blade, and 1 beta build of Sacred Stones. We'll be taking a look at all 3, and we're starting with Blazing Blade. These 2 builds are known as 0206 and 0219, respectively. These stand for the dates when they were made, February 6th and 19th of 2003, so these are from around 2 months before the game's release. The game is fairly close to release since the game was set to come out only 2 months later, but there are still a few oddities in the code that I want to explore. These 2 builds have a lot of graphics that are different from the final game. First off, Ninian's dancer rings were initially scarves, and these have the same color schemes as their released counterparts. Raven and Heath's hair colors were originally completely different, and we have different sprites for all 3 lords too. Lynn and Eliwood's sprites here were redone and repurposed to come out in the final game, but the Hector sprite shown here was entirely cut out by release day. These prototypes have quite a few variations on the cutscene still images. Only 2 of them are exactly the same as they are in the final game, and those are from Lynn mode. Even so, there are a few images from Lynn mode that change between the prototypes and the final game. Starting around the halfway point of the game, the images become much less complete, and some of them are only sketches that have no colors or shading. On the slideshow, you can see the picture in the desert that interestingly contains Eliwood and Ninian. These 2 are absent from the final version. Speaking of absences, all of the art here is missing the sepia layer over the top, so we can see the images in their original colors. As for our last tidbit for this section, we have interesting character information that was uncovered in the prototypes. The 2 subjects of interest are Eleonora and Igreen. In the final game, the code for 0x29 is a copy of Nils, but here it's a version of Eliwood's mother instead, and she is located close to the playable characters. The version of her in the final game has growth rates even though she only appears in cutscenes, so maybe this means that she was going to be playable at one point in development. No one can say for certain. As for Igreen, she can be found in the line of code for 0x2b. In the final game, this line is a copy of Vida, but here in the prototype, it's Igreen. Her weapon ranks are incredibly strange. A in swords, S in lances, and C in axes, despite the fact that her class is archer. Her affinity is different in this game than it was in Binding Blade. Here, her affinity is anima, even though it was ice in Binding Blade. Because of how different this version of Igreen is from Binding Blade, I don't think she was ever planned to be playable. If she was going to show up at all, I can only assume it was for a cutscene only, since she was nowhere near close to being playable with all of these oddities. Much like with Blazing Blade, Sacred Stones' beta build was released to the public when it was leaked during a hack of Intelligent Systems data. Later on, I'll be giving an in-depth demo of the debug map found within the game, since it is the most interesting part of the prototype. For now, though, let's take a look at the other things found outside of the debug menu. First, we have portrait changes. There are a lot of smaller portrait tweaks, so I'm focusing on the biggest and most obvious shifts. First up, Mulder's clothing is completely different in the final game. Ford and Kyle are interesting because they actually swapped colors. Ford used to be green while Kyle was red, and they were changed to reverse their color schemes at some point in development. The beta version of La Rochelle used Tana's design, and the same applies to Tethys and Nami. Tethys originally looked like Nami, but she received a new sprite when her old design was repurposed for Nami. In fact, this beta build implies that Nami was added much later on in development because of how incomplete she is in the debug menu, so this makes a lot of sense. Amelia was also added very late, and in this prototype, Tana uses Amelia's sprite when appearing in the story. Joshua is completely absent from this version of Chapter 5 too, implying he was a later addition as well. We move next into the changed graphic in the Tower of Volney. The victory screen here is very clearly a placeholder because of how flat and incomplete it is. We also have a different version of the world map that diverges from the final game's version in a few places. More specifically, it's missing a lot of locations that were present in the released game. The prototype of Sacred Stones is interesting because it has a lot of maps in varying states of completion. Some maps are almost entirely finished, while others are a little bit less composed. The Lagdo ruins are definitely on the messier side. Some of them are fine, some of them crash, and a third group simply looks unpleasant. I'm very glad this was changed before the release of the final game, because sheesh. Quite a few maps are similar to their iterations in the final game, but there are some that have a bit less in common with the released version of Sacred Stones. For example, the prototype's Chapter 6 was changed to be Chapter 11 of Erica's route in the final game. A new map was made entirely for Chapter 6. On top of that, Chapter 7 used to be a Fog of War map, and I'm very glad that was removed, because Fog of War is never fun to deal with. Up through Chapter 8, the game is actually decently complete, and there are even scripted events that happen with full dialogue. As you get deeper into the game, maps become less and less complete, so we don't know all that much about the later chapters from the prototype. In fact, everything after Chapter 8 has no dialogue at all, and the maps become much messier. Some of them even have numbers showing through the textures. Chapter 11 on both routes is outright missing, and Chapter 5X is nowhere to be found either. The endgame of Sacred Stones has not been created yet either, so it is instead the Dragon's Gate from Blazing Blade. This only really scratches the surface in terms of intriguing things here, though. If you're interested, I highly suggest checking out and playing this prototype for yourself if you can. There's only so much I can go over here, but it really is interesting. Path of Radiance has a bunch of different builds that we know about since its pre-release process was documented very well. Before we get into the details about the various builds we know about, though, I want to say that Path of Radiance was never planned for the N64. A lot of people have seen beta versions of this game, and since they don't look much like the final game, they assume they were put together for the N64. That isn't the case at all. Path of Radiance started development after Blazing Blade, and therefore after the GameCube had come out. The game was in development from 2003 to 2005. The only Fire Emblem game that was ever on the N64 during its development was Binding Blade, back when it was known as Maiden of Darkness. Our first piece of information about Path of Radiance was a picture of Ike fighting an enemy soldier. There are a lot of strange tidbits in this picture, though. For example, the enemy is a soldier who should be wielding a lance, but he is instead holding a sword. There are also impossibly low critical hit rates for killer weapons as well, so this probably isn't an actual screenshot as much as it is a mock-up and proof of concept for the first 3D Fire Emblem game. This screenshot came even before Ike was named Ike. His beta name was Paris, a name that was reused for Ike's descendant in Awakening. Priam's name is, well, Priam in English, but in Japanese he takes his name from Ike's beta name from early in Path of Radiance's development. The first known build we have is from April of 2004. We have a bunch of screenshots of it, and quite the healthy bit of information too. We know there were 2 maps for this build, but unfortunately we only have screenshots of one of them. The map is rough and simple, and while it bears slight resemblance to the first chapter of the final game, it's still pretty different. There are 8 playable character units here. Ike, Soren, Rolf, Titania, Reese, Leith, Marcia, and Zyhark, and they are facing off against Dayan soldiers. The battle scenes seem to take place on the map, and they are zoomed in compared to the shots where the units are navigating the map. Maybe combat animations were planned to be direct zoom-ins at first. The enemy units do not have distinct models yet, and they all pull from a model that would later become the fighter model in the final game. Reese uses a healing staff of some kind in one of the screenshots, and the particle effects are pink instead of teal like in the final game. Soren, meanwhile, uses a basic fire tome that uses an early version of the final game's L-Fire animation. The stat screen is very different from the final game, and the background has a picture of the Tower of Guidance from Benyon. Constitution and Weight are added with everything else instead of being sectioned off on their own. Titania's sprite looks a bit different, and she was originally planned to be primarily a lance user instead of an axe user like in the final game. The vulnerary in her inventory is blue instead of beige. Here, Ike has a rapier. This weapon was replaced with the regal sword in the final game. The menu cursor is a metal gauntlet like in the final game, but it is perched sideways instead of diagonally here. Lastly, we have a picture of a conversation between Soren and Leith. This discussion between them is not present in the final game, but it is in line with their strained relationship as is shown in Chapter 8 of the released game. This version of the game was never released publicly, but a slight evolution of it was made into a demo at E3 in 2004. There aren't many differences between the April 2004 and the E3 2004 builds, so I've chosen to group them together here, especially since we don't have all that much information about the E3 2004 build other than the fact that it was pretty similar to this version. After E3 happened, we got another major build for Path of Radiance. This time it was in November of 2004, and the game received a demo for the Nintendo Touch World DS events that took place across Japan. This build is massively different from the E3 version, and it has made massive strides toward the finished product we know today too. This demo had a finished version of Chapter 1 for players to sample to see if they liked the game. There are a handful of subtle differences from the final game, though, and the first of them is Ike's initial personal weapon. In the final game, the weapon is called the Regal Sword, and he received it in Chapter 4. In this demo, though, Ike has the sword in Chapter 1, but it's instead called the Long Sword. This actually makes a lot of sense, since in the final game, the Regal Sword is referred to as the Long Sword eternally, so the rename probably happened pretty late into development. The dialog box and stat screen windows are slightly different from the final game too. The dialog box has a light gradient to it, and the stat screen has the Tower of Guidance in the background still. Even though the dialog box looks different, the text is the same as in the final game. The font the text is shown in is simpler than the final game, which uses a serifed font instead of a sans serifed one. The one unusual tidbit about this version of the stat screen is that it includes minor stat increases stylized like the Lagoo's transformation stat changes. We don't know for sure where these increases are coming from, though. It could be terrain, support bonuses, an early version of biorhythm, or something else entirely. We're just not really sure. In theory, we would know for sure if this build of the game ever got leaked or released somewhere. This is a full demo, and it was playable at various kiosks across Japan, so we know that there is a playable form of it. It would be great if this somehow found its way into the public hands one day. I know I would be there instantly to see what I could do if I wound up with Path of Radiance's demo files. Our next build takes us to November 2004, and we have a bunch of screenshots published in the Nintendo Dream issue for the month. This build is much closer to the final game, but there are still a few differences to note here. First off, the shove commanded is highlighted in yellow from the commands menu. In the final game, it's white. And the only yellow command in any menu is Ike's direct ability. The HP bars during battle scenes are ever so slightly different, and the font for the number is italicized far more than in the final game. On top of that, the units' names are featured at the top of the HP bar when they are absent from battle animations in the final game. The enemy Myrmidons are covered in a faded blue, but they never appear with this color in the released version. Similarly, the bandits appear to wear an olive green color that resembles Radiant Dawn far more than Path of Radiance. Next up, we can see the stat screen. Titania is very close to the final version, but it still has the Lagoo-style stat increases that were removed from Bjork units in the released game. Her base stats are slightly lower here, and she doesn't start with her Iron Axe either. The vulnerary is still blue, like in past builds though. Soren's stat screen also has a few differences. First off, the Bjork unit type icon is a placeholder. He originally had a lower HP base stat, and Adept cost 5 fewer points of capacity than in the final game. So we're definitely getting closer to the final game, but there are a few differences of note here. Water break. Our next build takes us to January of 2005. We have a bunch of images from a promo reel for Path of Radiance, and we're creeping closer to the final game, though there are still a few notable differences from the completed release. This build is different from everything that came both before and after it, and that means we've got to talk about it now. First off, the HP bars are looking a lot more elaborate than in the final game, looking more like Radiant Dawn than Path of Radiance. At this point, though, the far more interesting fact is that the damage, hit, and critical stats are included in the battle animations where they are not in the final game of Path of Radiance. Path of Radiance is the only Fire Emblem game that doesn't show this information during combat animations. The HP bars looked the same during map animations too, as they do during combat animations. The level up window is getting closer to the final game, but it's notably less elaborate than the one we have come to know so well. The game was 1 month away from release in March of 2005, so nearly everything seen in screenshots was the exact same as the finished game, with one exception. Soren's Elwyn tome still doesn't have a complete icon, and it instead uses a placeholder tome instead. Elwyn's animation is a lot duller, too. The enemy Myrmidon is wearing red here instead of orange, which is the color the enemy units use in Chapter 13 of the final game. This must be Chapter 13, since this is the only boat map where Myrmidons appear as enemies, making it a little strange. The HP numbers also look slightly different. The developers were clearly working on Path of Radiance right up to the last minute, if there were still changes to be made a month before the Japanese release. Our final beta build for Path of Radiance comes in the form of a demo presented at E3 in 2005. This marks our third and final demo after the ones presented at E3 2004 and at Touch World 2004. This one, however, is the first one to have been presented in English. This demo is close to the final game, but it isn't quite there yet, since the voice acting is still in Japanese and has not yet been dubbed over. The demo contains chapters 13 and 16, and they are set to the easiest difficulty. Unfortunately, this demo has not been seen since E3 2005, and we do not know anything about how the other chapters may have looked at this point in time. We have very few images of a beta build of Radiant Dawn, and we really don't know much about this game's time in development. The pictures we have are low in quality and were first shown in hands-on previews that do not have complete video footage. One picture has a draft of the title screen, which includes Ragnell, a Londite, a Heron, and Leiron's medallion. Micaiah can be seen fighting Kanagas in another picture, and it has the background in some camp setting. Maybe it has something to do with the supply burning chapter in Part 3? No one knows for sure. Lastly, we have a picture of an early portrait for Nolan, and it is unsettling. Other than these three images, though, we really don't know much about Radiant Dawn's beta builds. There must be a full build attached to these three images, but the details have been lost to time. Water break. Our final beta build isn't really a beta build at all, at least not in the traditional sense. Instead, it's a tech demo for a game that was never actually released. Fire Emblem Wii is a tech demo that was developed in the late 2000s, and it was an experimental game developed after Radiant Dawn's release. Most people didn't know this game was being made at all until after it had completed development. Much like with Maiden of Darkness, a lot of the information we have about Fire Emblem Wii originates in the Making of Fire Emblem book. The Wii tech demo was planned to be very different from the rest of the Fire Emblem series, playing as a real-time strategy game like Pikmin instead of the turn-based tactics Fire Emblem is known for. The game had a mode known as Field, where the player would control a group of characters through the world. The player could interact with NPCs, encounter enemies, and explore the map freely. When encountering an enemy, an icon would appear, and the player would initiate combat after making contact with the enemy. The map was planned to include towns, buildings, caves, and more. The camera was set in third person, but could be altered according to the player's control. We don't know if the camera was planned to be more controllable than just zooming in and out, though. The Making of Fire Emblem book doesn't say. Interestingly, the Wii tech demo may have been planned to take place in Talius if it was made into a full game. The images of the demo include Stefan, Ileana, and Reese from Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. We don't know for sure if they were placeholders or if this was actually meant to be an extension of Talius' story. This is certainly a strange collection of characters to put together, so I'm willing to assume that they were placeholders, especially given the lack of major characters from Talius. Fire Emblem Wii, as far as we know, was never really meant to release. There weren't proper ideas to back it up, nor was there an objective in development beyond exploring the technology. We don't know if any builds of the game survived, or even if Intelligent Systems still has a copy of it. We also don't know how far the game got into development before it was shelved. There's just not all that much information about it, unfortunately. Even if a copy does exist, there's a strong chance it won't even be playable because of how incomplete the game may be. Fire Emblem Wii's legacy lives on through Echoes of all games. The exploration concept was reused in Echoes, and the map contained in Fire Emblem Wii concept art kind of resembles the maps on the bottom screen of Echoes on the 3DS. In that way, the spirit of Fire Emblem Wii has lived on even though it was never meant to release publicly. I would love to see Intelligent Systems revisit this idea of a real-time strategy Fire Emblem, but I doubt that will ever happen, especially since we didn't know Fire Emblem Wii existed until years after it had been shelved. Still, it's a very interesting piece of this series' secret history. For the last two segments of this panel, we'll be looking at the prototypes of Sacred Stones and Blazing Blade. I will be going through a few things in each beta build and highlighting what I feel are the most interesting points of these two games. We're going to start with Sacred Stones because it's a bit further from completion, so there's not as much to look at, and the game is much less complete. After that, we'll be going into Blazing Blade, which is closer to release and has a bit more to sink our teeth into in terms of content that functions. There are also a few unique things in Blazing Blade that do not have an equivalent in Sacred Stones, so we'll be covering the basics in Sacred Stones and then going to Blazing Blade for slightly more interesting tidbits. For the Sacred Stones section of the demonstration, I will be showing you all what you can do within the debug map of the game. Much like with Blazing Blade, all footage you see here was recorded by me. It's also all in Japanese, so if you can't read Japanese and want to check this out for yourself, you'll probably want to have a guide pulled up so you know what each option does. That's what I did. Before we get into the video, though, I want to show off the debug menu that loads upon opening up the game. The first option, Release Entry, starts the game from the beginning. Continue Chapter resumes an in-progress file. Manual Continue resumes a suspended file. Initialize File is meant to wipe all save data, but it doesn't work properly, so the function hadn't been fully implemented yet. The world map will take the character to the world map so they can access a skirmish. The most important option is the one at the very bottom where you can select what chapter you want to play. Interestingly, Ephraim's chapters here refer to him as Urzark, even though the rest of the build correctly calls him Ephraim. Interesting. You can enter any chapter through scrolling this list, though not all of them work the way you would expect. If you hold L while opening a chapter, then tutorials will be disabled for the chapter. We won't be looking at any specific chapter from the final game, though. Instead, our attention is going to the debug map and everything you can do there. So, let's dive right in. Upon loading into the debug map, you will hear a very notable difference from the final game. This is not the Sacred Stones soundtrack. This entire prototype uses the soundtrack from Blazing Blade, and our debug map uses Wind Across the Plains, Lynn's map theme from Blazing Blade. What if we wanted to change that, though? We would open up the map debug menu and scroll through the options. A lot of these are identical to the final game. Unit, status, options, retreat, suspend, and end. The next option, Charge, lets you choose what army you control. You can either set the player or enemy units to be controlled by the computer, the player, or no one at all. Next, there's the debug menu, and this is the one we are going to be taking a look at. The bottom option here lets you change the music, and now we can swap away from Wind Across the Plains into something else, though the music is all from Blazing Blade since the Sacred Stone soundtrack hadn't been implemented yet. It is worth noting, though, that if you enter a battle animation or do anything else to change the music, the song choice you have made will reset back to Wind Across the Plains. As for the other options on the debug menu, let's go through them. Map will let you choose a chapter to boot up, debug info toggles on the debug display, weather, which is where we're at right now, lets you cycle through the various weather effects found in Blazing Blade and Sacred Stones. Playthrough number lets you change what number your current playthrough is, up to 13. Clear will pop up with a text box, and when you scroll to the bottom, you can click Understood to set the file to its epilogue state. The next line has the tactician data from Blazing Blade, even though there is no tactician in Sacred Stones, and you can toggle the tactician on, change their affinity, and increase the number of tactician points you have. Good Night activates sleep mode, but you can exit this by holding L and R at the same time. And there you go, there's a music change. So next up, we're going to take a look at the characters. First off, the enemy units are essentially clones of our army, as you can see here, though there are a few differences. For example, the enemy units have these strange tents that are poisoned. These are actually the prototype versions of the Gorgon eggs from when the developers were still figuring out how to make them work. They still don't entirely work here, but that's what they are. So now let's take a look at our forces. Some characters have sprites that are pretty similar to how they look in the final game, but in other cases they're a bit less complete. I said before that Naomi was probably added much later on in development, and part of that is because her profile here is so incomplete. She doesn't even have a portrait, where so many other early recruits do. Interestingly, Inez is a monk here despite being a sniper in the final game. Also, we have playable monsters here, and they have battle animations, but they're a little bit incomplete and clunky. Before we go into battle animations, though, I want to show off some other interesting things you can do in the character menu. For example, you can change the stats of a specific character as much as you want. You can move them up or down as long as they remain within the limits of the character's stat caps. So for the sake of demonstration, I made Erica incredibly strong. In fact, we can do something else with her too. We can toggle what weapon she is using, as well as raise her weapon rank. So let's find her a good sword to use. Every single weapon from Blazing Blade is included here in Sacred Stones, so we can scroll through all of them on this menu until we find the one we want. In the end, I chose to go with the Wormslayer here. As you can see, we have Erica, and she has battle animations that are very, very different from the final game. She's also the only character in this lineup to have a custom battle color palette. None of the other characters have that yet. There's one interesting weapon we can look at when going through the scroll here, and as you can hear, Wind Across the Plains is back, because we did something to change the music. Ephraim is going to be our sample guinea pig for checking out a weapon that is special, so we're going to raise his weapon rank and then start scrolling through every single item in the game. Obviously, he can only equip the lances, so lances are the only ones that are lit up right now. Every single item from Blazing Blade is in this game, as I said previously, because, obviously, Sacred Stones didn't have its original qualities yet, and they used Blazing Blade as a base. Now that we're getting to the extra weapons, we see that notable weapon, and that is a spear, very far from all of the other lances in the game. So if we give it to Ephraim, look at his stats now that we have the spear, and this isn't just any spear, but actually the Uber spear that Vita has in Blazing Blade, and it's displayed separately from all other weapons. So now let's take him into battle. His sprite is a little bit interesting, though. It's just Hollywood. So, Ephraim is very incomplete at this point. He doesn't even have a lance-wielding character as his battle animation sprite. And speaking of battle animations, we're going to look at a couple of other battle animations, this time for monsters. Their animations are not very complete, but they're pretty interesting. There are a couple of playable monsters to show this off. These animations are definitely clunky, and obviously, monsters don't use dragon stones in the final game, but we can still see what the animations would one day become. Another funny thing you can do here is put a ballista into the inventory of an archer, and just have them use a ballista. Funny enough, Naimi is the archer that's here, and she uses the animations of a male archer, despite being a female archer who uses Rebecca's animations in the actual story chapters of this beta. Here's the only place where it's not like that. Next up, let's take a look at the summoner. The summon feature actually does work in this version of the game, and we can summon an axe wielder to fight with us. Said axe wielder has the same glitchy portrait you can find in the enemy control glitch from Blazing Blade and Sacred Stones, though, so it's pretty incomplete, but surprisingly still functional. Now let's do our two last things in this demonstration. Visiting the two villages. The first one shows off all of the maps in the game, so you can see them all for yourself. However, this isn't perfect, and you can see it in the fact that our units just get plopped down onto whatever tile matches their current position, regardless of if it is a space they can actually stand on. Some of these maps are also incredibly glitchy, and you are going to see that very soon. Numbers like to creep through, right there, or some tiles will just be black. All of Erica's maps are marked with E up in the top left corner, and then Ephraim's are marked with I, because his beta name was Urzark, spelled I-R-Z-A-R-K, hence the I. Maybe in the rest of the beta, he is generally referred to as Ephraim, but I guess when going about the maps, they decided to keep I for Urzark there, just so that it was easier to tell apart from Erica. Also, you could see very briefly, and you'll be able to see again very shortly, the final chapter of the game is not at all the final chapter of Sacred Stones. That one hasn't even been started in terms of Sacred Stones development. It is just a final chapter of Blazing Blade. And here it is. That's just Blazing Blade for you. And now, we're back. We're back to the debug menu again. So lastly, we are going to go on and enter that other house. I mentioned different sprites before, so let's see some of those different sprites for the beta build in action. If you click B at a slow pace, then they will scroll across the screen as normal. Through this, we can see a few oddities, the first of which is coming up in a couple of seconds. There's a character that doesn't have a sprite yet, and another one. But the interesting thing is right here. Inez used to be Artur, hence why he shows up as a monk instead of a sniper on this map. And he also takes Artur's place in the character lineup, which is done in recruitment order. So all of the other sprite changes from before are also in effect here, like Amelia being Tana and Tana being Larachelle. Kyle and Ford are also here with their swapped colors, and Kyle's original sprite doesn't have a proper blinking animation. Joshua is notably entirely absent from this lineup, and he doesn't even have a blank portrait to walk across the screen. Also, I played through this demo all the way through Chapter 8, and like I said before, Joshua just flat out isn't in this at all, which I think is very interesting because I would not expect him to be one of the last characters added in development. We're getting to the end of the playable characters here, and obviously as you get later into the game, there are fewer of them that have complete sprites. And now, if you press B too quickly, the game will start to cannibalize itself as these sprites stack on top of each other, which is why I said before that you need to press B slowly to advance this. And that right there is a soft lock and your controller stops listening to you. And that is also where we will be leaving off here. If you would like to check out the rest of the Sacred Stones prototype, it is freely available on Serenus Forest, and there are a lot of interesting things to dig into that I couldn't show you here. So if you find this cool, then I can't recommend checking it out enough. It is in fact very cool. For the Blazing Blade demonstration, we will be taking a look at the 0206 build of the game, and I'm sure a lot of you are wondering, why 0206 and not 0219? This is because there are a few interesting debug menus that are present in the February 6th build of the game that had already been removed by the time of the February 19th build of the game. And since Sacred Stones was already our basic debug crash course, I wanted to do something a bit different with Blazing Blade. Before we get into it, though, here's the menu that you see upon loading at the prototype. From here, you can select any map you want to play manually, but the characters will have their base stats instead of being scaled to fit the current chapter you are playing. You can also start the game from the beginning, though some of the maps will become less complete and a bit messy as you get deeper in. We're going to be going to the debug map and playing around a bit with that, and more specifically, we'll be looking at the character menu that is found only in the February 6th build of the game. Upon loading into the game, we have the same menu as what we saw in Sacred Stones, and we're going to use it to load into a map, the one labeled Test. Upon opening it, Elliewood moves, and a dialogue exchange pops up, and it looks... yikes! Okay then. After that, it goes back out into the rest of the map that has no music, and we can look at the units we have here. Since this prototype was from around 2 months before release, a lot of things here are pretty complete. Merlinus is an exception for us, though, and his little sprite on the map isn't complete. It's just a recolored version of Roy with blue hair and green clothing. There's something else odd about this map, though, and that would be the female thief. There aren't any playable female thieves in Blazing Blade, though, and that's true, because this is Layla. I don't think she was ever planned to be playable or anything, but it's still very interesting that you can find her here in some form or another. She doesn't have a smaller sprite to preview on the map, since she was never meant to be seen in this way, but it is her. This map has a very strange set of units on it in general. Elliewood, Hector, Ninian, Barter, Jafar, Vida, Urk, Priscilla, Luis, Layla, and Merlinus. Much like in Sacred Stones, we can turn their stats up and down as we choose, and you can do the same to enemies as well. I chose to superpower Urk because he's one of my favorite units from Blazing Blade, so he gets 20 magic just as a treat from me. It's so strange watching this all play out without any music. At least the Sacred Stones version was nice to us and had music. You can play with the enemy's stats as well, and here I decided I wanted to play with this knight. Maybe make him Urk food. So, turn his stats down all the way, and there you go. Urk food. Next up, there are some villages here that are meant to be used for testing various conversations. If we go to this one in the middle of the map, we can see a conversation between Jafar and Nino, and then, very rudely, Elliewood shows up. And here he comes. There he is. From there, we can click through the dialogue options to see Elliewood's sprite change through its various expressions and variations. Interestingly, it is Elliewood here regardless of who the visiting character is. These 3 houses on the top row cycle through a bunch of locations in the game. No text box shows up in any of them, though you can see the little triangle that indicates there would be a text box there, but there's nothing. I'm not going to be going through all of these locations just for the sake of time, but I will be going to the third house on this top row because one of these backgrounds is very obviously broken. It's coming up pretty soon. There's a second row of houses after this that does this exact same thing with just cycling through a bunch of images from the game, but instead it does it with character sprites. The first house is for all playable characters and major NPCs, and the second is for bosses and antagonists, with the third for minor NPCs. That was the messed up one right there. All individual sprites are displayed separately in these houses, so expression changes will show up on their own, and not just like, there's not just one for Elliowood, there also is one for his different sprites. Next, let's take advantage of something I didn't do during Sacred Stones, which is taking control of the enemy units. You can set both sides of a battle to be controlled by the player here, so I did that, and bam! Now when we end the player phase, we're controlling the enemy without even needing to use the mind glitch. So let's have our Weekend Knight attack our super-powered Urk. Just as a treat for me. Yeah, that ended about how I thought it would. It's very cool that you can do this in this version of the game, and it's especially ironic since the final game obviously has a glitch that also lets you do this. There's one other interesting menu I want to check out here, and that is the character debug menu. You can open this up by holding down select and then hitting start twice. Right there, I made a save state, and you'll see why in a second. I struggled to open up this menu a little bit. It's okay. Again, you do it by holding down select and then hitting start twice. Here we are. So the first option here will let you max out a character, so we'll do that for Hector, and now all of his stats are capped with a minor menu disturbance. Next, you can set the HP of the character to influence their attack and movement AI. The second option from the bottom, Recovery, controls their AI when they have a healing item in their inventory. And lastly, Condition lets you cycle through any status you want, but be careful not to scroll too far, because that'll happen, that's a soft lock, and that's why I made a save state. Now, let's go to the main reason that I wanted to show you guys version 0206 instead of version 0219, the Battle Debug menu. It was removed by the time of the 0219 build, but we can do it just fine here. To open it, you hold down L and R at the same time and then press B, which is obviously a lot easier to do on official hardware than with a messed up emulator with keyboard controls. Now that we're on this menu, we can do all sorts of stuff and simulate any battle we want. And I'll pause it to talk about the different options here. So, in order, the options are as follows. Name decides which characters will fight. Class will decide if the units are promoted or not, though if you do this on any pre-promoted character, they'll remain in their base class. You can't, for example, take Luis, who is a sniper, and scale her back down to archer, because the game just doesn't have data for that. Army will change the character's color to show if they're a player, enemy, or NPC unit. Weapon decides the weapon type, but if you do want to play around with this, you are going to have to set the weapon type to a type of weapon that specific unit can use, otherwise the simulation won't start. So, for example, you can't have Urk use an axe because he's incapable of using axes. And lastly, action will show what the character will do in battle, which is the last option, and both sides have to agree. So you can't have one of the sides say that you're going to heal while the other says you're going to fight. You also can't have two units like being the initiating attacker at the same time. If you violate this, then the simulation just won't start. So, with all of that exposition out of the way, let's do what we came here to do and simulate a few battles. The default here is set to Elliowood, so let's have two Ellywoods fight each other. I put them both to tier 2, gave one a sword and one a lance, and then set up their battle commands, so it all works out. The base option here is 0 on the action command, since that means an attack. And then for the other Elliowood, we went over to 6, so that he was just standing still to let our second Elliowood take the attack. And bam! These battle simulations have no chances of missing or critting, and both spots have dashes in them instead of number. All attacks here will do 10 damage regardless of any other factors. And there's something else you can do with the simulation mode. Trigger boss conversations. With our first slot, I gave Hector an axe and set him to his tier 2 class, and then with the second slot, I went to number 77, which stands for Darren, and I gave him a lance. Now we can start the simulation, and you'll see Hector's boss conversation with Darren play out. Interestingly, we can get two versions of Darren's sprite here, since he starts at tier 2. And if you try to knock him down to tier 1, which is obviously impossible, it won't downgrade him from general to knight, but it will change the colors of his sprite in this conversation. The boss conversation doesn't trigger a second time if you redo the simulation repeatedly, so it's only readable the first time you do this. There are a lot of fun and interesting things you can do in this character simulator. To my knowledge, there's not a list of what number corresponds to what unit, so you'll have to do a bit of trial and error, but in theory, you can set up any fight you'd like here. It's a very cool addition, and I think this alone makes it worth it to check out the 0206 prototype. Again, this menu is absent from the 0219 version, so if you want to see it, you'll have to play version 0206 specifically. I think everything here is really cool though, and I highly suggest you all check it out at some point to see what these amazing beta builds have to offer us. And with that, it brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you all for coming and listening to me ramble about Fire Emblem's various beta builds. I had a lot of fun putting this together, and I hope you all learned a little something new. If you want to support me in other ways, you can find my social media listed on the screen. I'll also include my YouTube playlist with my past EmblemCon presentations down in the description of this video in case you're interested in watching any of the others. If you have any questions for me, you can reach out on social media. If you're interested in learning more about these beta builds, the 3 best places to look are the Lost Media Wiki, Serenus Forest, and the Cutting Room Floor. All 3 websites have a lot of amazing information that I used to put this together, and you'll learn a lot from any of them. You can also find the prototypes on on Serenus Forest, I can't talk, if you want to play through any of the 3 beta builds of Blazing Blade and Sacred Stones that we have. Thank you all again for coming, and I hope you have a wonderful day.